Danny Haiphong joins us now. Danny, welcome, fresh from what I hope was a triumph. I haven't watched it yet, but I'm sure it was a triumphant appearance at the United Nations. Tell us what you said there and what they said back to you.
Well, thanks for having me back on, George. It's always a pleasure to be on your great program. So what I said during my briefing to the United Nations Security Council on the question of the dangers that Western armaments to Ukraine pose to global peace and stability was that the conflict in Ukraine is simply being escalated by the fact that the United States and NATO countries have committed so much militarily to Ukraine in complete contravention of the UN Charter, and in doing so have caused just a great deal of damage, not just to Ukraine, which is in the third month of this counteroffensive, which has seen over 43,000 Ukrainian forces killed, thousands of pieces of NATO armaments destroyed, but also to the United States, Europe and NATO itself. These countries are in free fall. There is an economic crisis across the world, and it's particularly hitting the US and Europe quite hard. And the military situation for these countries is also pretty dire, considering the fact that now you have, and I cited the fact that there are officials that come straight from NATO, that come straight from these hawkish think tanks, that are all admitting that not only is Ukraine unable to win this conflict against Russia, but also NATO countries, including the United States, are suffering mightily in terms of their ability to supply the weapons that Ukraine supposedly needs to win. So in effect, this is a losing battle that the United States and NATO are engaged in, and that it is in the interest really of everyone to stop. And it's only Russia and China also that are calling for, as permanent members of the Security Council, a real negotiated settlement to this conflict. And that is the irony. In terms of the response, though, the UK delegate, the French delegate, they were the most flustered by my remarks. The UK delegate called me a fringe journalist, while the French delegate claimed that Russia was simply calling the meeting in order to spread its propaganda. Mind you, all of the delegates from the collective West, the US, the UK, France, and as well as you could call extensions of the collective West, such as Japan, they all couldn't stop promoting Cold War talking points against Russia, politicizing the conflict, politicizing the UN Security Council, and making it all about how Russia not only needs to stop its so-called invasion, but really how Russia needs to be destroyed. This is the way they talk about this conflict, and it just goes to show which side they really are on. They are on the side of permanent war.
It's a paradox, though, Danny. If you read the more serious of the newspapers, magazines, listen to the more serious commentators, they're all saying now that the war is all but lost. And yet the yellow press, which is for the consumption by the masses, continues to talk nonsense about Russia losing hand over fist and so on. And the politicians ride that particular horse rather than the one in the more serious papers. So on the principle that throwing good money after bad is a bad idea, even for a fool, and reinforcing failure is a well-known foolhardiness. How come we're still doing it? Why did the Netherlands up the ante today spectacularly by effectively handing over their Air Force and their F-16s to Zelensky?
Well, and this is despite the fact that those F-16s are probably not going to get off the ground for another year, given what the United States has admitted about the training that is necessary to make these operable on the battlefield. So the reason why the collective West cannot seem to get out of its own way here And the reason why they're not listening to, I mean, the Pentagon said before the counteroffensive started, this probably isn't going to go well. The CIA admitted the same about the counteroffensive. And now you have articles coming out in the Washington Post today. You had a couple of days ago in Politico, all saying that the counteroffensive is not only lost, but maybe they should have listened. Maybe the Biden administration should have listened to Mark Milley, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when he said back in November of last year that perhaps there needs to be a negotiated settlement to this conflict because the future does not look bright for Ukraine. But the reason why these countries, why Europe, why this bloc of countries, these unipolarists, I would call them, the United States in the lead, continue to go down this path is because a conflict with Russia, a war with Russia, is really existential for the U.S. foreign policy establishment and the mega corporate forces, especially the military-industrial complex that control them. They see this as a conflict that must be fought at some level. And now they're just starting to understand that this whole notion that some kind of offensive is going to bring Russia down or take back territory is a moot point. But even their calls for so-called settlement or negotiation really just amounts to a freeze, or what NATO has tried to push to Ukraine, which Ukraine rejected wholesale, is NATO membership for Ukraine, while Ukraine cedes the fact that it's going to have to give up the territory that Russia has won. This is a non-starter for Ukraine, and not only this, but the only so-called peace settlement that the West really supports is a complete loss for Russia, is Russia's defeat. And that's just not going to happen. So there is this existential crisis for the collective West where they feel they need so badly to bring down Russia and what Russia represents as part of this rising multipolar world. But their means of doing it through a proxy war in Ukraine is just not working out. So it is quite the conundrum, and it's not one that they're going to be able to resolve lest they either admit defeat or they continue going down this path of destruction they've set for themselves.
Well, the heavyweight press talk in terms of a freezing of the conflict, of a Koreanization of the conflict, drawing a parallel somewhere, and neither war nor peace being the state of affairs thereafter. But why would Russia agree to freeze the conflict and allow those parts of the Ukraine that they have not yet taken to become, like South Korea, a super-armed NATO encampment? It's bad enough they're in Finland across the river. Why would the Russians agree to any such freezing of the conflict? As a matter of fact, every day that goes by, and I mentioned at the beginning of the show, there's a wholesale, described in the media I just read as unstoppable Russian advance towards Kupiansk this evening. Every day that goes by, the price of a negotiated settlement rises very steeply in terms of territory and other Russian demands, denazification, demilitarization, and so on. I don't see this ending in a Korean-style ending. I see it ending more in a Vietnam-style ending, with NATO clambering off the roof of the American embassy, trying to get a place on the last helicopter out of Kiev. What do you think?
Well, I think you're really onto something, George, because to be honest, the so-called Koreanization opportunity was lost after the Minsk Accords were completely and utterly trashed and destroyed by NATO itself, by the United States and NATO itself. It was they who used the Minsk Accords, who used this ceasefire agreement to build up Ukraine to the point of the time of the so-called invasion that Russia started. Throughout that period, throughout that 8-year period, it was the United States and NATO militarizing Ukraine, getting it ready, and also violating the accords at every step by continuing to shell and bomb and attack the Donbass. And that's why this conflict is currently at the stage that it's at. And so you bring up a really good point in conjunction with this, because not only does Russia have this experience of knowing what it's like to negotiate with the collective West and being burned by that, there's no trusting the collective West. But now you also have the fact that Russia is the one succeeding on the battlefield. Russia is the one that has the capabilities, that has the ability to continue to fight a war of attrition. It is not facing the severe shortages that the collective West is, and it is making headway on the battlefield. It has stopped this offensive. This Ukrainian offensive is all but defeated. So there is no reason for Russia to give any leverage to the collective West when it knows that doing so means that it's going to have to give concessions that it cannot allow to stand. It cannot allow Ukraine to be a part of NATO. It cannot allow Ukraine to be militarized in this way. The precedent had been set in 2014 during the coup, but really over the last 15, 20 years, when NATO was encircling Russia, we can go back 30 plus years, encircling Russia, moving up to its border, and of course Ukraine being on Russia's border, that being the red line that sparked this entire conflict. So there really is no reason, as you said, George, to enter into peaceful negotiations without the goodwill and good faith of the collective West in giving concessions to Russia that it has been asking for from the beginning, that its security interests are respected. And there is no real hope for that. And I think Russia understands this. That's why Russia says very firmly, we're not going to be negotiating with Zelensky or the Ukrainian government. We're going to negotiate with its masters. And only when its masters in the collective West are able to begin to forward a position that allows for Russia's existence and its interests to be respected, just like international law really does put forth quite clearly that in times of conflict, there needs to be good faith and goodwill in any kind of maintenance of this peace and stability that we also seek. But that has not been the case since the very beginning. And all the naysayers out there always like to forget, and they always like to erase the fact that this conflict began in 2014 with the coup, and then with the thousands upon thousands of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers and people in the Donbass residing along Russia's border being attacked and terrorized by the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian regime backed by the U.S. and NATO.
Let's, in the last few minutes, look at the slightly bigger picture. I was reading today not only the point that you made about these self-harming, even suicidal sanctions that the collective West has placed on Russia, which have turned out to be a gigantic boomerang, but the cementing of now an unbreakable relationship between Russia and China, the precise opposite of U.S. foreign policy goal since 1972 and President Nixon's visit, the first communique, and so on. The point of American policy from 1972 onwards was to keep Russia and China as separate as possible. Now they have made this great leviathan of Russia-China. You can say it in almost as one word, Russia-China. They've made this gigantic leviathan, which will surely be the core of this Eurasian future of which we talk. It's a spectacular foreign policy blunder by the West, isn't it? And was there any sign at the United Nations that any of them even have begun to realize that?
No, not at all. Actually, the United States in particular, but really the collective West as a whole, is on this suicide mission to try to galvanize any country within the global South, within the sphere, Eurasian sphere, and also in Africa as well, in Latin America, any country it can, and try to organize them against Russia and China, as if that militarily is actually going to meet the objectives that the United States has set forth at the moment. The reality is that China and Russia, of course, have their own independent political and economic reasons for developing a strong relationship. The Cold War was a disaster in large part because those two countries were split politically and then, of course, economically. Now, the interesting thing that is occurring is that when the United States, when the collective West go after Russia and China simultaneously, what they are really admitting to is the fact that they can't break the bond, that despite any attempts to forge some kind of foreign policy that is coherent and that targets a specific quote-unquote enemy, that by labeling Russia and China as kind of equal players in the so-called threat category, what the U.S. is admitting is that no longer can it compete and no longer can it allow Russia and China to stand independent, sovereign, and united. But the more that it goes after both of these countries, of course, the more they are going to come together because they share an external enemy now. So this is quite the conundrum. It is one that is not going to go away. It is one that is kind of inevitable at this point because the United States and its NATO allies cannot afford to get close to either Russia and China for both political and economic reasons. And it's so interesting that in this moment when we're talking about the United States as kind of this declining empire, that you have this very clear set of lines being drawn where Russia and China are supposed to be the so-called enemies of the United States, but the only thing that could possibly save the United States from itself in foreign policy terms is by trying to divide the two. So that's why you have competing strategies that really end up coming together and forming one foreign policy objective, and that is the destruction of both. And the fact of the matter is that the United States nor its so-called allies have any capability to do such a thing. China and Russia alone, standing alone, are powerful enough. Russia has shown it in Ukraine. China has shown it with its immense economic growth and its ability to cooperate with damn near everybody in the world. Russia, of course, not so close behind in that realm. These countries alone are able to stand up to the United States and the collective West. Together, they make up a force that is the leading one in multilateral, multipolar developments like BRICS, like SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, like, of course, the Eurasian projects of Belt and Road Initiative, Eurasian Economic Union. All of these projects really flash to us the future of the world order. And the United States and the collective West, by not being able to flexibly maneuver the international arena to meet its own interests, is really admitting and showing the world that, in fact, it really has no other cards to play, that it's either going to pursue this endless war, which could very go nuclear against these two countries, or it is simply going to, grind up into dust and float away in the wind, which is kind of what's happening right now because the United States is finding itself and its NATO allies are finding themselves on the outside looking in on all of these multipolar developments. And that is only going to make it more and more belligerent. So the writing is on the wall, and that is very clear to see when it comes to how the U.S. approaches Russia and China.